1955, when Harlem was the heart of a growing civil rights movement and the pressure of the times weighed heavy on its people, Lenny the Bull Carson, a well-known local mobster, made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his reputation as a feared enforcer made him untouchable. He thought he could disrespect the wrong people, challenge the wrong families, and walk away scot-free. He didn't know that his arrogance would lead him straight to the legendary Bumpy Johnson, a man whose very name could change the course of a life, or end it. Lenny's disrespect wasn't just directed at anyone, though. It was aimed at Bumpy's wife, Essie Johnson, a woman of strength, elegance, and grace, beloved by all who knew her. She had long been seen as Bumpy's equal, a queen beside her king in Harlem. The misstep, however, came when Lenny made the grave mistake of laying his hands on her in public, dismissing the well-known rule in Harlem: respect the Johnsons. The consequences of that action would stretch far beyond a slap. It would haunt Lenny for the next 11 years, with him facing the consequences of his arrogance every single day. Lenny Carson was a man of power in Harlem. Standing at 6'3", with muscles that could intimidate a small army, he was known as the Bull for his brute strength and unyielding will. His reputation was one of dominance and fear. He controlled a small network of clubs, casinos, and illicit businesses, and everyone in Harlem knew to either pay him respect or pay the price. But there was something Lenny didn't fully grasp: the unspoken rules of Harlem. It wasn't just about controlling territory or striking fear into others. It was about respect. And the moment he laid his hands on Essie Johnson, that balance was shattered. He'd always been the kind of man who believed that might made right. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that, in Harlem, the most dangerous man wasn't the one with the biggest muscles, but the one with the deepest respect and connections. And no one had more respect than Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy, on the other hand, wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a man of integrity, at least when it came to loyalty and respect. He'd built an empire in Harlem, not by violence alone, but through wise alliances, carefully calculated moves, and a code that demanded loyalty in both business and family. He was feared, yes, but also admired. And for him, the woman by his side, Essie, wasn't just a partner. She was his equal, the backbone of his life. For Bumpy, disrespecting Essie wasn't just an offense against her. It was an offense against everything he stood for. That's why Lenny Carson had just made the biggest mistake of his life. When Lenny slapped Essie Johnson in that crowded Harlem club, it wasn't just a slap. It was an attack on everything Bumpy held dear: his family, his honor, and his standing in the community. The incident was an insult to the very code that had kept Harlem under the protective arm of the Johnson legacy. It was an act of arrogance that threatened to unravel the delicate balance that had kept the peace in Harlem for years. The community, who had long respected Bumpy, now had to watch as their leader's family was disrespected in the most public of ways. Lenny's actions weren't just a personal grievance. They were an attack on Bumpy's empire, a declaration that even the great Bumpy Johnson's rules could be ignored. The moral line had been crossed. In Harlem, disrespecting a man's family was an unforgivable offense. But Bumpy, known for his patience and strategic mind, wasn't about to strike impulsively. Instead, he would let Lenny think he had gotten away with it. For 11 years, the tension would build, the waiting game would play out, and the trap would slowly close in on Lenny, who would eventually find himself not only apologizing for what he'd done, but begging for his life. But Bumpy's response wasn't just about punishing Lenny. It was about teaching a lesson that would ripple throughout Harlem for years to come. Respect was everything, and those who broke the code would always be held accountable, even if it took a decade for the full consequences to arrive. It started on a night like any other. Essie had just finished a night out with some of the women from Harlem. The club had been crowded with the usual characters: businessmen, hustlers, gamblers, and socialites, all trying to stay ahead of the law and one step ahead of each other. Lenny Carson, with his broad shoulders and confident swagger, was a fixture in the club scene. He liked to throw his weight around, flaunting his power to anyone who would listen. On this particular night, however, his display of arrogance would cost him everything. Essie, ever the composed woman, had been enjoying a quiet conversation with a few old friends when Lenny made his move. He had been drinking, as he often did when the night wore on, and his usual cocky demeanor had turned sour. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone as respected as Essie. She had always been untouchable, too dignified for the likes of him, but that night, his pride wouldn't let it go. Lenny approached the table, his loud voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "What, Essie? Think you're too good to talk to me now?" he sneered, the drunken bravado evident in his tone. When she didn't respond, his patience thinned. "I'm talking to you, lady. You better show me some respect." Essie, not one to engage with disrespect, simply turned her head and gave him a cold, dismissive glance. It was a glance that said it all. "You're not worth my time." That was all it took. With a quick, brutal motion, Lenny slapped Essie across the face, sending a shockwave through the room. The music faltered. The conversation stopped. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had frozen. Lenny stood there, the club silent around him as Essie rubbed her cheek, staring up at him with eyes full of fury. The anger in her gaze was palpable, but there was no fear. She had no reason to be afraid, not of him, not of anyone. But what Lenny didn't know was that he had just crossed a line no one in Harlem dared to cross. The room stood in stunned silence. People whispered, but no one dared to step in. Lenny was the man they feared, and Essie was the woman everyone loved. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, something began to shift. Word spread quickly that Lenny Carson had laid hands on Essie Johnson, and the rumor began to travel, as whispers always did in Harlem, that Bumpy's wife had been disrespected in the worst possible way. But what Lenny couldn't understand, in his drunken stupor, was that Essie Johnson wasn't the target. His slap wasn't an attack on just a woman, it was an affront to a legacy, a line of respect, and a man who would never forget. Bumpy was not one for immediate reactions. He never rushed, never acted out of anger or impulse. He was a man of strategy, and he had always been calculated, patient. But when the news reached him, when the whispers finally reached the one man in Harlem who controlled the streets, the weight of it settled over him like a dark cloud. Essie was his everything, his equal, the mother of his children, his partner in everything. So, when he heard the news that Lenny Carson, that arrogant mobster, had dared to put his hands on her, something deep inside him snapped. But Bumpy, ever composed, didn't rage. Instead, he took a deep breath and walked away from the madness that had begun to swirl around him. He sat in his office, alone, reflecting on what had happened. His fingers drummed on the edge of the desk as he stared out the window at the Harlem streets below. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low but full of purpose. "You know," he said, to no one but himself, "in this life, you have two choices. You either let things slide, or you make them right. You can be a man of patience, or a man of action. But either way, the world will show you who you really are. and the world will know when I've had enough." Bumpy's words were never empty, never just for show. His philosophy ran deeper than simple street justice. For him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching respect. In his mind, Lenny Carson was about to learn the hard way that in Harlem, you don't disrespect the family. You don't disrespect Bumpy's wife and expect to walk away unscathed. The silence of that moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Bumpy was calculating, laying the groundwork for something that would shift the balance of power in Harlem forever. He didn't need to act right away. He would wait. And Lenny would have no idea what was coming. For 11 years, Lenny had lived under the false impression that his actions had been forgotten. He lived as though the slap, the ultimate sign of his disrespect, had been swept under the rug, that Bumpy had forgiven him, or had simply moved on. But Bumpy had never forgotten. In the shadows of Harlem, he had quietly observed, waiting, biding his time. Lenny may have been enjoying his life, his businesses, his ego unchecked. But what he didn't know was that Bumpy was always watching, always preparing. For Bumpy, the lesson wasn't going to be swift. It was going to be calculated. It was going to last. It was going to make a statement that would reverberate through Harlem for years to come. Lenny would never forget the consequences of disrespecting Bumpy's wife, and in the end, he wouldn't have to. Because every day, for the rest of his life, Lenny would be reminded of it. In the meantime, Lenny carried on, thinking he had gotten away with it, never knowing that the trap was slowly closing in. Every step he took, every decision he made, brought him closer to the reckoning he would never see coming. Bumpy wasn't the type of man to make a move without planning it carefully. Over the years, he'd heard of Lenny's continued bravado, how the man had grown bolder, how he'd flaunted his dominance over the streets. But every time Bumpy heard Lenny's name, it was like a small fire smoldering in the pit of his stomach. He never forgot. The day would come, and when it did, Lenny would finally understand the true cost of disrespect. The months had turned into years, and Bumpy's patience was about to pay off. He'd kept his ear to the ground, listening to Lenny's movements, watching from the shadows. Every player in Harlem, every corner of the city had become part of the plan. Bumpy's reach was long, his network wide. The moment was near, and all Bumpy needed was the right catalyst. It came in the form of a charity event. Lenny, in a display of misplaced confidence, had decided to host a lavish fundraiser at a luxury hotel, surrounded by the elite of Harlem's underworld. The event was set to mark the apex of his power in the community. It was his moment to remind everyone just who he was. But what Lenny didn't know was that Bumpy had arranged for every angle to be covered. Every man on the inside was positioned, watching, waiting. The trap was set, and Lenny had no idea he was walking right into it. Bumpy had spent months getting the right people in place. He'd placed his most trusted men in key positions around the hotel. The timing was perfect. The evening of the event would be his moment to make Lenny understand that in Harlem there were consequences to disrespect. As Lenny made his grand entrance into the ballroom, he felt invincible. The music thumped, and the rich and powerful of Harlem surrounded him with flattering words and fake smiles. But something was missing. The usual feeling of power and control felt different tonight. Bumpy's men, stationed in the shadows, exchanged looks of silent understanding. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. All Bumpy had to do now was make his entrance. It was exactly 11 years to the day when Lenny Carson would face the consequences of his actions. The charity event was in full swing, and the ballroom glittered with the presence of Harlem's finest, men and women who had been both his allies and enemies over the years. But tonight none of that mattered. Tonight the real reckoning was about to unfold. Lenny, surrounded by his entourage, walked through the crowd with the same arrogant swagger he had always carried. He was untouchable in his mind, his wealth and power blinding him to the fact that the man he had insulted all those years ago had been patiently waiting for this very moment. It wasn't until the lights flickered, casting a brief shadow over the room, that Lenny felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around, sensing something was off, and then he saw him, Bumpy Johnson. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Bumpy walked through. He wasn't dressed in his usual attire. No, tonight was different. He wore a sharp black suit, his face calm, his eyes cold and focused. His presence filled the room, drawing all attention, his every step deliberate and measured. Lenny froze. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He had heard whispers over the years, but now, here, standing in front of him, was the living legend. The man who had patiently waited for the right time to remind him of the rules, the undisputed king of Harlem. "You," Lenny stammered, his voice faltering. "You're Bumpy Johnson." Bumpy's gaze never wavered. He was calm, collected, the very picture of unshakable confidence. "You made a big mistake, Lenny," Bumpy said, his voice as smooth as velvet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 consequences. "But mistakes can be corrected, and I'm the one to correct it." Lenny's arrogance had crumbled into something resembling fear. He tried to straighten up, to reclaim some of the power he thought he still had, but it was too late. The room had fallen silent, all eyes now on him, the respect that had once been his, gone. "What are you going to do?" Lenny spat, his voice trembling. "You think you scare me?" Bumpy took a step forward, and the air in the room grew heavier. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate. He took his time, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build. "I don't need to scare you, Lenny," Bumpy replied, his words calm but filled with an authority that rang through the room. "But I'm about to remind you what happens when you disrespect my family." The seconds seemed to stretch on forever. Lenny's mouth went dry as he looked around, realizing that he was trapped in his own arrogance. His mind raced, looking for a way out, but there was none. The walls had closed in on him, and the trap was set. The next few moments unfolded with swift precision. Bumpy didn't raise his hand, didn't even need to make a sound. His men moved in, surrounding Lenny and his crew. The look in Bumpy's eyes was enough to send a message to everyone in the room. This was his territory, and he controlled everything. Lenny was dragged outside into the cold night air, where he was forced to kneel. The humiliation was palpable. His power, his wealth, his bravado, none of it mattered now. Bumpy stepped forward, placing a hand on Lenny's shoulder. "You've been apologizing to me for 11 years, Lenny," Bumpy said, his voice low but filled with finality. "You just didn't know it yet." With that, Bumpy's men escorted Lenny out, leaving him with only one choice: to walk away with his dignity shattered, or to meet the consequences he had long been running from. In the end, Bumpy's justice was delivered, not with violence, but with humility and reminder. Lenny would never forget the lesson he had been taught, and for the next decade, he would spend his life in constant apology to the very man he had once dared to disrespect. The legend of Bumpy Johnson only grew stronger after that night. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire, and Lenny Carson's name was now synonymous with respect. But not the kind he had once sought. No, Lenny had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one, not even the strongest or the most feared, could escape the consequences of crossing the line in Harlem. As for Bumpy, his legend remained untouchable. His respect, earned through wisdom, loyalty, and action, was unquestioned. Harlem knew, without a doubt, that the Johnson family was not to be trifled with. And for Essie, the queen by his side, nothing had changed. Bumpy had protected her, just as he always promised. But it was the world around them, the streets of Harlem, that had been reshaped by that night. As for Lenny, he never regained the power he once had. The community remembered the lesson, and even 11 years later, he was still apologizing daily to Bumpy, to Essie, and to the people of Harlem. What happened that night in Harlem wasn't just about revenge. It was about a principle, a code that had been laid down for generations. Bumpy Johnson knew the value of respect, and he made sure the world knew what would happen when it was violated. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot. The moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem, and in the comments, what would you have done if you were Lenny Carson? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.